Those shoes do not belong in a place like this. The words landed louder than the clink of crystal glasses, sharp enough to turn heads across the polished dining room. Emily Carter froze for half a second, her hands still gripping the tray, her worn sneakers peeking out beneath the hem of her black uniform. The restaurant glowed with soft golden light, the kind that made everything look expensive, curated, untouchable. And yet, in that moment, every eye seemed fixed on her shoes. Alexander Hayes did not raise his voice, but he did not need to. His tone carried the quiet authority of a man used to being obeyed, respected, never questioned. A billionaire seated at the best table in the room, surrounded by tailored suits and effortless wealth, he barely glanced at her face. His gaze had already dismissed her. Emily swallowed, forcing her fingers not to tremble as she set down the final plate. She had heard worse before. Words did not break her anymore. Not after everything. But something about the way he said it, casual, effortless, as if she were not even human enough to offend, lingered longer than it should have. She turned away, steady, composed, even as a faint flush crept up her neck. Outside, the city stretched wide and indifferent, neon reflections flickering across rain-slick streets, unaware that a single sentence had just drawn an invisible line between two lives. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Emily pushed through the heavy kitchen doors, the noise of the dining room fading into the clatter of dishes and low voices behind her. She exhaled slowly, pressing her back against the cool tiled wall for just a second. Then she moved again. There was always more work to do. Always another table. Always another shift to finish. Hours later, when her shift finally ended, the night had grown colder, the kind of cold that settled deep into your bones. Emily stepped outside, pulling her thin jacket tighter around her, her shoes damp from a long day on her feet. The streetlights hummed overhead, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. That was when she saw it, a dark leather wallet, resting near the curb where luxury cars had lined up earlier. She hesitated, glancing around. No one else seemed to notice. Slowly, she bent down and picked it up. It was heavier than she expected. Inside, neatly arranged bills, crisp and untouched, more money than she had held in months. Her breath caught for a moment. Rent, groceries, her younger sister's school supplies. Every problem seemed to whisper her name at once. Then she saw the card. Alexander Hayes. The name hit like a quiet echo of that voice from earlier. The same man. The same eyes that had looked right through her. Emily stared at the wallet for a long second, the cold wind brushing against her face, pulling strands of hair loose. She could walk away. No one would know. No cameras here. No weaknesses. Just one small choice in a city full of strangers. But instead, she closed the wallet gently, her fingers tightening around it as something steadier rose inside her. Not pride, not anger, something quieter, something stronger. She slipped the wallet into her bag, lifted her chin, and looked down the long stretch of empty street ahead of her. If she was going to return it, she would have to walk. Miles of dark sidewalks, past neighborhoods that changed from polished glass to flickering street corners. Her shoes were already worn thin, but she started moving anyway, one step after another, into the cold night, carrying more than just a wallet in her hands. The cold pressed harder as Emily Carter kept walking, her breath forming soft clouds in the night air, each step echoing faintly against the empty sidewalks as the city slowly shifted around her from polished storefronts to quieter, dimmer streets where the glow of luxury faded into flickering streetlights and closed shops. And still she did not stop because the weight of the wallet in her bag felt heavier than leather and paper. It felt like a decision she had already made but had not yet completed, and somewhere behind her the world of Alexander Hayes continued without her, unaware that the distance between them was being crossed one step at a time by someone he had already dismissed. Inside the towering glass headquarters of Hayes Group, Alexander stepped out of his car with the same calm authority he carried everywhere. The valet greeting him by name as he moved through the revolving doors into a lobby of marble and quiet power, where everything reflected precision and control. Yet as his hand slipped into the inner pocket of his coat, something small but immediate disrupted that control, the absence of his wallet, and for the first time that night his expression shifted, subtle but sharp, as he paused mid-step, checking again, slower this time, then turning to his assistant who had just approached with a tablet in hand, his voice low but edged. "My wallet. It is not here." The assistant blinked, already scanning possibilities, but Alexander did not wait, his mind replaying the evening in fragments. The table, the conversation, the moment he stood, and then, unexpectedly, a brief image surfaced, a pair of worn shoes against polished floors, dismissed just as quickly as it had appeared, because to him it had meant nothing at the time, and yet now, in the absence of something he valued, the smallest detail began to return with quiet persistence. Back on the street, Emily adjusted the strap of her bag as her pace slowed for a moment near a bus stop, the metal bench cold and empty, a route map glowing faintly under dim light. She glanced at it without really seeing it because she already knew she could not afford the fare, not tonight, not with every dollar accounted for. So she kept moving, her shoes pressing against the pavement, damp, worn, but steady, and with each block the city grew quieter, the buildings taller, cleaner, guarded by glass and silence. Until finally she stood across the street from the Hayes Group Tower, its height cutting into the night sky, its entrance bright and untouched by the world she had just walked through. Inside, security moved with routine efficiency, eyes trained, posture rigid, the kind of place where nothing unexpected was allowed to pass unnoticed, and yet Emily stepped forward anyway, crossing the street, her reflection briefly catching in the polished glass doors before disappearing as they slid open, warm air meeting her face, carrying the faint scent of polished wood and quiet wealth. She hesitated for just a fraction of a second before stepping inside, the sound of her shoes soft against the gleaming floor, but still loud enough in her own ears to remind her exactly where she did not belong. The guard at the front desk noticed her immediately, his gaze dropping, not to her face, but to her shoes, and then back up again, with a look that had already decided everything about her before she spoke. "Can I help you?" he asked, though his tone suggested otherwise. Emily reached in her bag, her fingers brushing against the wallet before pulling it out, holding it carefully. "I need to return this. It belongs to Alexander Hayes." The guard's expression did not change, but something colder settled behind it, a quiet disbelief. "You can leave it here." Emily shook her head gently, not out of defiance, but certainty. "I would rather give it to him directly." For a moment, silence stretched between them, the kind that carried judgment without needing words. And somewhere above them, in a building filled with glass offices and guarded doors, a man who had once dismissed her stood, unaware that the same person he had reduced to a pair of shoes had just walked miles through the night to return something he had lost. The guard did not move, not at first, his eyes lingering on Emily Carter as if waiting for her to reconsider her own request. But she stood still, the wallet held carefully in both hands, her posture quiet but unwavering. And after a moment, he exhaled through his nose, reaching for the phone on his desk with a practiced motion that suggested this was not the kind of situation he enjoyed dealing with. "Stay here," he said flatly, already turning away as he pressed a button and spoke in a low voice, mentioning the name Alexander Hayes with the kind of respect that did not need to be explained, while Emily remained where she was, aware of every detail around her, the polished floor reflecting her worn shoes, the soft hum of distant elevators, the quiet efficiency of a world that moved differently from hers. And yet she did not step back because she had not come this far to leave something unfinished. Upstairs, Alexander stood near the wide glass window of his office, the city, stretching beneath him in perfect lines of light and motion. But his attention was elsewhere, fixed on the absence that still lingered in his pocket, his assistant speaking in the background about canceling cards and contacting security, when a brief interruption came through the internal line, a pause, then a few quiet words that shifted the room. "There's someone downstairs asking to return your wallet," the assistant relayed her. Tone careful, as if unsure how seriously to take it. Alexander turned slightly, his expression unreadable, Describe her, he said, and there was a small hesitation before the answer came. Young woman, early 20s, dressed in a service uniform. Shoes are... The assistant paused again, searching for a word she did not say out loud. But she did not need to finish, because the image had already returned to him, clearer now, sharper than before, and something in his gaze changed, not softened. Not yet, but focused. Send her up, he said. Back in the lobby, the guard's posture shifted just enough to signal a change in authority as he gestured toward the elevators. You have been cleared. Go to the top floor. And for a brief second, Emily blinked, not expecting the door to open so easily. But she nodded once, quietly, and moved forward, the elevator doors sliding shut behind her with a soft final sound that sealed her inside a space of mirrored walls and quiet ascent. And as the numbers climbed higher, she caught her reflection again, her hair slightly disheveled from the wind, her jacket thin, her shoes worn but clean, and she straightened just a little, not to impress, but to remind herself why she was there. When the doors opened, the air felt different, quieter, heavier with intention. The hallway leading her toward a set of glass doors where Alexander Hayes stood waiting, not seated, not distracted, but present in a way he had not been before, his silhouette framed by the city behind him. And for a moment neither of them spoke. The distance between them filled with everything that had already happened and everything that had yet to be understood. Then Emily stepped forward, closing the space with steady steps, stopping just short of his desk as she held out the wallet. You dropped this, she said simply, her voice calm, without accusation, without expectation, and Alexander looked at her, really looked this time, not at her shoes, not at her uniform, but at her face, at the quiet certainty in her eyes, and slowly he reached out, taking the wallet from her hands, opening it almost immediately, his gaze flicking across the contents, the cash, the cards, everything exactly as it had been, untouched, complete, and something unspoken settled in the room, a silence that carried weight, because this was not a transaction he was used to, not a world he controlled. And when he looked up again, there was the faintest shift in his expression, not quite an apology, not yet, but no longer dismissal. You walked here, he said, more a statement than a question, his voice lower now. And Emily gave a small nod. Yes, nothing more. And for the first time that night, Alexander Hayes did not have an immediate response, because the simplicity of her answer carried something he could not easily categorize, something that did not fit into his understanding of value or exchange. And as the silence stretched, the distance between them no longer felt defined by wealth or status, but by a single choice that had just been made and returned without condition. Alexander Hayes held the wallet in his hand a moment longer than necessary, his fingers resting against the smooth leather as if confirming its reality. But his attention remained fixed on Emily Carter, on the quiet steadiness of someone who had walked miles without complaint and now stood in front of him with nothing asked in return, and that unfamiliar imbalance unsettled him more than the loss itself ever had. Because in his world, everything had a price. Every action and expectation, every favor and exchange. Yet this moment refused to follow that pattern. He closed the wallet slowly and set it down on his desk, his gaze lifting back to her, sharper now, searching for something hidden beneath the surface. Why did you not keep it? He asked. Not accusing, not even suspicious, but genuinely uncertain, as if the answer might reveal a rule he had never learned. And Emily did not hesitate, her voice calm, almost simple. Because it is yours, she said, and there was no performance in it, no attempt to impress, just a statement that existed on its own, complete and unembellished. And for a second the silence between them deepened, carrying more weight than before, because her answer offered no space for negotiation, no room for interpretation. It simply was. Alexander exhaled softly, a small shift in posture breaking the rigid control he carried, and he reached into his jacket, pulling out a stack of crisp bills, placing them on the desk with a smooth motion. Take it, he said, his tone measured, almost automatic, the solution he had always known, the one that resolved every imbalance he encountered. But Emily's eyes dropped to the money only briefly before returning to his face, and she shook her head. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just once, firm and quiet. "I did not come for that," she replied, and something in the way she said it landed differently than any refusal he had heard before, because there was no pride in it, no defiance, only clarity. Alexander's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in something closer to confusion, because he was not used to being denied. Not when he offered something that could solve problems he assumed she must have, and yet she stood there unchanged, untouched by the value he placed on those bills, and for a moment he studied her again, more carefully this time, noticing details he had overlooked before, the faint wear on her sleeves, the way her hands were steady despite the cold she must have walked through, the quiet dignity that did not demand recognition but existed anyway. "You could use it," he said, softer now, less certain, and Emily gave a small breath that might have been a quiet laugh if it carried any amusement. "Maybe," she admitted, and that single word held more truth than anything else she had said, because it acknowledged the reality he assumed, without surrendering to it. "But it would not be right," she added, and again, there was no elaboration, no justification, just the same steady certainty that had carried her through the night, the city lights. Behind Alexander flickered faintly against the glass, reflecting in his eyes as he stood there, the distance between them no longer defined by wealth, but by something he could not measure, something that did not fit into his systems or strategies. And for the first time in a long while, he found himself without a clear response, without a solution that could resolve what he was feeling, and that absence lingered longer than any silence before. Emily shifted slightly, not uncomfortable, but aware that her part in this moment had already been completed. "I should go," she said gently, and there was no expectation in her voice, no pause waiting for permission, just a quiet closing of something that had begun long before she stepped into the building, and Alexander did not stop her immediately, his gaze following her as she turned, the soft sound of her shoes against the polished floor echoing faintly as she moved toward the door, and with each step the presence she carried seemed to linger behind her, filling the space in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling, because it was not tied to power or status, but to something far simpler and far more difficult to replicate. Just before she reached the door, he spoke again, the words coming slower this time, less controlled. "Emily," and the sound of her name in his voice felt different, as if he had only just learned how to say it. She paused, turning slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge him. And for a moment he seemed to search for something more to say, something that would match the weight of what had just happened. But all that came was a quiet, almost uncertain, "Thank you." And it was the first honest thing he had offered her, stripped of assumption, stripped of control. And Emily met his gaze for a brief second, her expression soft but unchanged. "You are welcome," she said, and then she turned back, stepping through the door and into the hallway, leaving behind a silence that did not feel empty, but altered, as if something small and unmeasured had just shifted in a world that had always believed it understood everything. The elevator doors closed behind Emily Carter with a soft final sound, and, as the building disappeared from view, the warmth she had briefly stepped into faded, replaced again by the cold night waiting outside, and yet something inside her felt lighter, not because her life had changed, not because anything had been fixed, but because she had done what she believed was right, and that was enough, at least for now, as she stepped back onto the sidewalk, the city stretching out before her once more, the distance she had walked now waiting to be retraced, her shoes pressing against the pavement with the same quiet rhythm as before, worn but steady, carrying her away from a world that had never truly been hers. High above, in the office she had just left, Alexander Hayes remained standing where she had walked away, his eyes still fixed on the door long after it had closed, the silence in the room settling deeper than before, because something about that encounter refused to fade, refused to be categorized or dismissed, and slowly, almost unconsciously, he moved back to his desk, opening the wallet again, checking it once more as if expecting something to be different, but everything remained untouched, every bill, every card, exactly as it had been, and yet the absence he felt now had nothing to do with what had been lost or returned. It was something else entirely, something he could not quantify. His assistant stepped closer, cautious, observing the shift in his demeanor. Should I proceed with canceling the cards as a precaution? She asked, but Alexander shook his head slightly, his gaze still distant. No, he said quietly, and then after a pause, pull the security footage from tonight. His tone returning to its usual control, but carrying a new purpose beneath it, one that had not existed before. Minutes later, the screen in front of him flickered to life, showing the exterior of the restaurant. The moment he had stepped out, the blur of passing cars, and then a small figure appearing near the curb, Emily bending down, picking up the wallet, and for the first time, Alexander watched what he had not seen before, not just the action, but what followed, the hesitation, the stillness, the decision, and then the direction she chose, not away, but forward. And as the footage continued, another camera picked her up blocks away, then another, each frame capturing a piece of a journey he had never imagined anyone would take for him. Miles of quiet determination. No hesitation, no deviation, just a straight path back to him. He leaned back slightly, his jaw tightening, not in anger, but in something more complex, something that felt uncomfortably close to realization, because every step she had taken contradicted the assumptions he had made, not just about her, but about people like her, about value, about worth, and, as the final clip showed her entering the building, pausing only briefly before stepping inside, something settled in his chest, heavy and undeniable. Across the city, Emily reached her apartment building, a narrow structure tucked between older brick walls, the hallway dim and quiet as she stepped inside, climbing the stairs slowly, her body finally acknowledging the mile she had walked, her legs aching with each step. But she did not complain, not even to herself, because she had learned long ago that some things were simply part of moving forward, and when she reached her door, she paused, listening for a moment before stepping inside. The small space warm but modest, a faint light glowing from the corner where her younger sister sat with a book open in her lap. Looking up immediately as Emily entered, her expression soft with relief. "You are late," she said gently, and Emily smiled faintly, setting her bag down. "I had something to finish," she replied, her voice calm, steady, and for a moment, the world outside disappeared, replaced by something simpler, something real, something that did not measure worth in numbers or status. Back in his office, Alexander stood once more, the city lights reflecting behind him, but now they seemed different, not because they had changed, but because he had begun to see them differently, and without another word, he reached for his phone, his decision already made. "Find her," he said, his voice firm, no longer uncertain, because for the first time in a long while, something had moved beyond his control, and he was not willing to let it disappear. Morning arrived quietly, the kind of gray, muted morning that carried the weight of unfinished thoughts, and in a small apartment across the city, Emily Carter moved through her routine with the same steady rhythm she had built over years of necessity. Her alarm already silenced before it could ring twice, her movements careful not to wake her younger sister who still slept on the narrow bed by the window. The faint sound of traffic drifting in through the thin glass as she tied her hair back, and stepped into the kitchen corner where a single pot waited on the stove, and though her legs still ached from the mile she had walked the night before, she did not slow down, because life did not pause simply because she was tired. She poured water into the pot, measured out what little coffee remained, and leaned against the counter for just a moment, her eyes drifting to her shoes resting by the door. The worn fabric slightly darker from the damp pavement, the stitching along the sides, holding them together with quiet resilience, and she let out a small breath, not regret, not exhaustion, just acknowledgement, because those shoes had carried her farther than most people would have gone, and they would carry her again today. Across the city, the glass tower of Hayes Group reflected the early light as Alexander Hayes stood in his office, already dressed, already composed, but not untouched, because the decision he had made the night before had set something in motion that he could not ignore, his assistant standing across from him with a tablet. Her voice precise as she reported. "We identified her through the restaurant records. Emily Carter. She works 2 jobs. Lives in a residential building on West 73rd Street. And Alexander listened without interruption, his gaze steady, absorbing each detail not as data, but as something more personal than he was used to allowing. "Schedule nothing this morning," he said after a moment, his tone firm, leaving no room for negotiation, and the assistant hesitated for only a fraction of a second before nodding. Already adjusting the day he had just cleared. Back in her apartment, Emily gently shook her sister awake, her voice soft. "You need to get ready for school." And the girl stirred slowly, rubbing her eyes before sitting up, her expression still heavy with sleep, but easing as she looked at Emily. "Did you eat?" she asked quietly, and Emily smiled faintly, handing her a cup. "We both will," she replied, deflecting without denying, because some truths did not need to be spoken out loud. Time moved quickly after that. Footsteps down narrow stairs, the hum of the city growing louder as they stepped outside. Emily walking her sister several blocks to the bus stop, waiting until she boarded safely before turning back, her own path leading in the opposite direction, toward another long shift, another day of work that would not ask how far she had walked the night before or why, only that she continued. But as she reached the corner near the restaurant, something unexpected disrupted that familiar rhythm. A sleek black car parked just beyond the curb, its presence out of place among the older vehicles and worn sidewalks. And before she could fully process it, the door opened, and Alexander Hayes stepped out, his posture composed, his gaze already fixed on her, as if he had been waiting. And for a brief second, Emily stopped, not out of fear, not out of surprise, but because the world she had left behind had just crossed into hers without warning. Alexander took a step forward, closing the distance slightly. The city noise fading into the background as his voice broke the space between them, quieter than before, but carrying a weight that had not been there the night before. "I needed to see you again," he said, and this time there was no dismissal in his tone, no assumption, only something direct, something unfamiliar. And Emily studied him for a moment, her expression calm, unreadable, as if measuring not his words, but the reason behind them. And for the first time since they had met, the balance between them did not feel one-sided, because he had come to her, and that alone had already changed more than either of them fully understood. Emily Carter did not answer immediately, her eyes resting on Alexander Hayes as the early morning light stretched across the street between them, the city moving around them in its usual rhythm, people passing by without noticing that something unusual had just settled into the air. And for a moment the contrast between them felt sharper than ever, not because of what separated them, but because of how deliberately he had stepped into her world, standing there without the distance he normally maintained, without the protection of glass walls and controlled spaces, and she studied that choice more than his words. "You found me," she said finally, her voice calm, not surprised, not impressed, simply acknowledging what had already been done, and Alexander gave a slight nod. Not denying it, not explaining it either, because there was no version of that answer that would not sound exactly like what it was: deliberate, intentional, and, perhaps for the first time, something he had done, without a clear objective beyond understanding. "I wanted to speak to you without all of that," he said, his gaze flicking briefly toward the restaurant behind her, the place where everything had begun with a single careless sentence. And Emily followed that glance for just a second before looking back at him. "You already said what you needed to say," she replied. Not harsh, not defensive, just honest. And that honesty landed heavier than any accusation could have, because it left no room for him to dismiss it or redirect it. Alexander exhaled slowly, his posture shifting slightly as if adjusting to a conversation he did not fully control. "No," he said, quieter now. "I said something I should not have," and the admission hung between them, simple, direct, but significant because it was not something he offered easily. And for a brief second, Emily's expression softened, not in forgiveness, not yet, but in recognition that something had changed, even if she did not fully trust it. "People say things like that all the time," she answered, her tone even, and there was no bitterness in it, only experience, the kind that came from hearing similar words in different forms, in different places, over and over again until they became part of the background noise of survival. Alexander watched her carefully, noticing that lack of bitterness, that absence of anger, and it unsettled him more than if she had raised her voice or turned away, because it suggested something deeper, something he had not accounted for. "That does not make it right," he said. And this time, there was no hesitation in his voice, only a quiet certainty that seemed new even to him. And Emily tilted her head slightly, considering him, as if weighing whether those words carried meaning or were simply another version of what people said when they realized they had crossed a line. "No," she agreed after a moment. "It does not." And the brief alignment in their words created a pause that felt different from the ones before. Less guarded, less distant. A car passed behind them, the sound briefly filling the space before fading again, and Alexander took a step closer, not enough to invade her space, but enough to shift the distance into something more intentional. "I misjudged you," he said, and this time the words carried more weight, not just an acknowledgment of what he had said, but of what he had failed to see, and Emily's gaze did not waver. "You did not know me," she replied, and that distinction mattered, because it removed intention from the mistake while still holding it accountable, and Alexander nodded slightly, understanding that difference more clearly now than he would have before. The morning light grew brighter, reflecting off the windows around them, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence no longer uncomfortable, but filled with something that had not existed between them before, a fragile shift, not yet trust, but no longer dismissal. And as Emily adjusted the strap of her bag, preparing to continue her day, Alexander spoke again, his voice steady, but carrying a question he did not yet know how to frame. "Let me make this right," he said, and this time it was not an offer of money, not a transaction, but something less defined, something he was still learning how to express. And Emily looked at him for a long second, her expression thoughtful, as if deciding whether what stood in front of her was the same man from the night before or someone beginning to change. And when she finally answered, her voice was calm, grounded, and unmistakably clear. "Then start by understanding why it mattered," she said, and with that, she turned slightly, not leaving yet, but shifting the direction of the conversation into something deeper than either of them had expected. Because for the first time, this was no longer about a wallet or a mistake. It was about what lay beneath both. Emily Carter did not move right away after her own words settled between them, the morning air carrying a quiet stillness that seemed to wait for something more, and Alexander Hayes stood there, absorbing what she had said, not as a challenge, but as a direction he had not expected, because understanding was not something he was used to earning. It was something he assumed came naturally with status, with position, with authority. And yet here, standing on an ordinary street corner, he realized how little that had actually taught him. "Then tell me," he said finally, his voice lower, more deliberate, and for the first time since they had met, there was no trace of control in it, only intention. And Emily studied him for a moment longer, as if deciding whether he was capable of hearing what she was about to say. And when she spoke, her words came steady, unhurried, shaped by years of experience rather than a single moment. "It was not just about the shoes," she began, her gaze briefly dropping to them before lifting again. "It is what people think when they see them," and Alexander followed that glance, noticing the details he had ignored before, the careful stitching, the worn edges that had been maintained with effort, not neglect, and something in his chest tightened slightly because what he had dismissed as unworthy now carried a history he had never considered. "You saw them and decided what I was worth." Emily continued, her voice calm, not accusing but clear, not just in that moment, but as a person, and the simplicity of that truth left no room for him to deflect, because it was not exaggerated, it was not emotional, it was precise, and that precision made it harder to deny. Alexander nodded slowly, the movement subtle, but genuine. "I did," he admitted, and the words did not come easily, but they came without resistance. Because for the first time, he could see the connection between what he had said and what it had meant beyond his intention. And Emily watched him, measuring not the apology, but the understanding behind it. And after a moment she continued, "Most people do," she said, and there was a quiet acceptance in her tone, not resignation, but awareness, the kind that comes from living with something long enough that it becomes familiar. It does not always sound like what you said, but it is there. And Alexander's gaze shifted slightly, taking in the street around them, the passing faces, the unnoticed details of a world he rarely paid attention to. And for the first time, those details seemed sharper, more defined, as if something had been brought into focus. "And you still chose to return the wallet?" he said, the question underlying his words clear, because he was trying to reconcile what he was learning with what she had done. And Emily gave a small nod, her expression unchanged. "What you said does not change who I am," she replied, and the quiet strength in that sentence settled into the space between them. Steady, undeniable, because it was not something he could offer, not something he could buy or influence. It was something she carried on her own. A faint breeze moved through the street, brushing against them both, and Alexander let out a slow breath, something shifting inside him, not dramatically, not suddenly, but with a weight that suggested it would not easily reverse. "I've spent most of my life believing I understood people," he said, almost to himself, but loud enough for her to hear. "What motivates them, what they value, what they are willing to do," and he paused, his gaze returning to her. "But I was wrong." And the admission was not about a single moment anymore. It was broader, deeper, touching something fundamental in the way he saw the world. And Emily listened without interrupting, because she recognized that shift, even if she did not fully trust it yet. "Understanding is not something you decide once," she said after a moment, her voice softer now, but no less clear. "It is something you keep choosing." And that idea lingered between them, simple, but challenging, because it required more than a single apology, more than a single action. It required consistency, something that could not be proven in one conversation. Alexander nodded again, this time more firmly, as if anchoring that idea in place. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence no longer uncertain, but reflective. And as the city continued to move around them, something had shifted in a way that neither of them could fully define yet. Because what had started as a moment of dismissal had become something else entirely, something that now demanded more than either of them had expected when they first crossed paths. The conversation did not end with her words, but something inside Alexander Hayes shifted in a way that refused to settle back into what it had been. And even as Emily Carter turned slightly, preparing to continue toward her day, he found himself still standing there, watching her with a focus that felt unfamiliar. Because for the first time, he was not trying to assess her value. He was trying to understand her. And that difference lingered long after she began to walk away. Emily did not look back immediately, her steps steady, her pace unchanged, as if this moment, however unusual, did not alter the reality she had to return to, the long hours, the responsibilities, the quiet endurance that shaped her life. And yet there was a subtle awareness in her posture, a sense that something had shifted even if she did not fully trust it yet. Alexander remained where he was for a few seconds longer before turning, his gaze following her path down the street, noticing the way she moved through the world without drawing attention, without expecting anything from it. And that image stayed with him as he stepped back toward his car, but he did not immediately get inside because for once he was not thinking about the next meeting, the next decision, the next outcome. He was thinking about her words, about what they revealed and what they challenged. The driver waited silently. The door opened, but Alexander closed it with a small gesture, choosing instead to walk a short distance along the sidewalk, his pace slower than usual, his attention no longer fixed on efficiency, but on observation. And as he moved through the neighborhood, he began to notice details he had overlooked before, the worn edges of buildings, the small businesses opening for the day, the people carrying their own quiet burdens. And for the first time, these were not background elements in a larger system. They were lives with stories he had never considered. Across the street, Emily reached the entrance of the restaurant, pushing the door open with the same quiet determination she had carried the night before, stepping back into the familiar rhythm of work, the clatter of dishes, the low hum of voices, the expectations that did not change no matter what had happened outside. And she moved through it all with practiced ease, greeting coworkers, picking up her tasks, slipping back into a role that required her to be present but unseen, valued only for what she provided. not for who she was. And yet something inside her remained slightly different, not because of Alexander himself, but because of the conversation they had shared, because someone from a world so far removed from hers had listened, even if only for a moment. Hours passed, the morning blending into afternoon, and still, the memory of her lingered with Alexander. Following him back into his office, into meetings he moved through with less attention than usual, his responses precise but distant, his focus drifting back to the same questions, the same realization that what he had believed to be understanding had been incomplete at best. And finally, as the day stretched on, he made a decision that broke from his usual patterns, one that was not driven by strategy or gain, but by something simpler, something he was still learning to recognize. By early afternoon, a car pulled up quietly near the restaurant. Less noticeable this time, less deliberate in its presence, and Alexander stepped out once more, not with the intention of confronting or correcting, but of observing, of seeing her world without interrupting it, and he remained outside for a moment, watching through the glass as Emily moved between tables, her steps efficient, her expression calm, her focus entirely on the work in front of her. And there was something in that image that held him there longer than expected, because it showed a version of her he had not yet seen, not defined by a single act of kindness, but by consistency, by effort repeated over time. Inside, Emily paused briefly as she passed the table, her gaze lifting for just a second, and through the reflection in the glass, she caught sight of him, standing outside, not approaching, not calling out, just watching. And for a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and something unspoken passed between them. Not resolution, not closure, but recognition, because this was no longer a coincidence, no longer a single moment. It was becoming something that extended beyond both of their expectations, something that neither of them had planned. And as Emily continued her work and Alexander remained where he was, the space between them felt different again, no longer defined by a single mistake, but by a growing awareness that their lives had intersected in a way that would not easily fade. The moment their eyes met through the glass did not last long, but it lingered in a way neither Emily Carter nor Alexander Hayes could ignore. And as she turned back to her work, her movement steady but slightly more aware, he remained outside for a few seconds longer before finally stepping away. Not because he had seen enough, but because he had begun to understand that simply watching was not the same as truly knowing. And that realization followed him back into the rhythm of his day like a quiet weight he could not set aside. Inside the restaurant, the pace picked up as the afternoon crowd arrived, voices rising, orders coming faster, and Emily moved through it all with practiced precision, balancing trays, remembering details, maintaining a calm presence even as the demands around her increased. And yet beneath that routine, something had shifted, not in what she did, but in how she was being seen. Because the same manager who had once barely acknowledged her now watched more closely, his expression sharper, not with respect, but with suspicion, as if something about her had changed in a way he did not trust. It did not take long for that tension to surface, because as Emily stepped away from a table, the manager called her back, his voice low but firm, a word, and she followed without hesitation. Stepping into the narrow space near the kitchen where the noise softened just enough to make the conversation private but not unnoticed, and his eyes narrowed slightly as he spoke. Who was that man outside? And Emily paused for a fraction of a second, not because she did not know the answer, but because she understood the implication behind the question. A customer, she replied simply, keeping her tone neutral. But the manager's expression did not ease. If anything, it tightened. Customers. Do not stand outside watching staff in the middle of the day, he said, his voice carrying a quiet accusation that did not need to be stated directly. And Emily held his gaze, steady, unflinching. He was not watching me, she answered, though she knew that was only partly true, and the manager let out a short breath, shaking his head slightly. Look, I do not care what arrangements you have, he continued, his words more pointed now. But this is a place of business, and I will not have distractions or problems brought in from outside. And the meaning settled between them clearly because he was not asking, he was warning, And for a moment, Emily felt the familiar weight of being judged without evidence, without understanding, reduced once again to an assumption that had nothing to do with who she actually was. She straightened slightly, her voice calm but firmer now. "There are no arrangements," she said, each word measured, and the manager studied her for a moment longer. Before giving a dismissive nod, "Make sure it stays that way," he replied, already turning back toward the floor. The conversation ending as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a quiet tension that did not fade as quickly as he had moved on. Back outside, Alexander had already returned to his car, but he had not left immediately, his hand resting briefly on the door before he paused. Something pulling his attention back toward the restaurant, and through the glass, he caught a glimpse of movement of Emily stepping away with someone, her posture composed, but her expression more guarded than before. And though he could not hear the words, he recognized the tone, the dynamic, because he had seen it countless times in different forms. Power questioning, assumption filling in the gaps where understanding was absent, and for the first time he did not observe it as a distant interaction. He felt it, the imbalance, the quiet pressure placed on someone who had done nothing wrong. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, because this was not a single moment, not a single mistake. It was a pattern, one he had contributed to without realizing the extent of it. And as Emily returned to the floor, continuing her work as if nothing had happened, the contrast between what he knew and what others assumed became impossible to ignore. He finally opened the car door and stepped inside. But this time, his decision was not to leave the situation behind. It was to change it. And as the engine started, his voice cut through the quiet interior, directed toward the driver, but carrying a purpose that reached beyond the simple instruction. "Take me back to the restaurant entrance," he said, and the car did not move away. It turned, slowly, deliberately, because this time, Alexander Hayes was not observing from a distance. He was stepping directly into a situation he had once been part of without question, and the difference between those two positions was about to become impossible for anyone around him to ignore. The car came to a smooth stop in front of the restaurant, and this time Alexander Hayes did not hesitate as he stepped out, his presence drawing quiet attention even before he reached the door, because people noticed power even when it was unspoken. And as he pushed the door open, the familiar sound of the dining room rose around him, conversations pausing just slightly, eyes shifting in subtle recognition. But he did not slow down, his focus fixed on a single point across the room where Emily Carter moved between tables, unaware that the balance of the space was about to shift. Emily felt it before she saw it, a subtle change in the room, a quiet tension that moved through the air like a ripple. And when she turned, her eyes met his again, closer this time, no glass between them, no distance to soften the moment. And for a second she stood still, not because she was surprised, but because she understood that whatever he had decided, it was no longer something happening quietly in the background. The manager noticed him almost immediately, his posture straightening as he moved forward, his tone shifting into something polite and controlled. "Mr. Hayes, we were not expecting you back," he said, a practiced smile forming. But Alexander did not return it, his attention remaining on Emily for just a moment longer before turning to the manager. And when he spoke, his voice carried a calm authority that silenced the nearby tables without effort. "I am here because of her," he said, the clarity of his words cutting through the room. And for a brief second, the manager's expression faltered, confusion replacing confidence as he glanced toward Emily, then back to Alexander. "Is there a problem?" he asked carefully, but Alexander's gaze sharpened slightly, not aggressive but precise. "Yes," he replied, and the single word carried more weight than anything else he had said so far. The room seemed to hold its breath as he continued. "The problem is how you speak to her." And the shift was immediate, not just in the manager's posture, but in the attention of everyone within earshot, because this was no longer a private interaction. It was something being brought into the open, and the manager's composure tightened. "I do not understand what you mean," he said, though the defensiveness in his tone suggested otherwise, and Alexander took a step closer, not raising his voice, but making sure every word landed exactly where it needed to. I mean that you assume things about her without knowing anything about her, he said. And the words carried more than just the moment from earlier. They carried the pattern he had begun to recognize, the one he had been part of, the one he was now choosing to confront. Emily stood still, watching, her expression calm, but her attention sharp, because this was not something she had asked for, not something she had expected, and yet it was unfolding in front of her in a way that felt both unfamiliar and undeniable, and the manager's gaze flicked toward her again. Then back to Alexander, his voice lower now. "If there has been a misunderstanding," he began. But Alexander interrupted him, not harshly, but firmly. "There has been," he said. And then after a brief pause, his tone shifted, becoming quieter, more deliberate, "and I was part of it." And that admission changed the moment in a way nothing else could have, because it did not place blame without including himself. It did not elevate him above the situation, it placed him within it. A murmur moved through the room, subtle but present, as people began to understand that this was not just a customer complaint. It was something deeper, something that challenged the assumptions they had all been part of in one way or another. And Alexander turned slightly, his gaze returning to Emily, not as someone he was defending, but as someone he was finally acknowledging. "She walked miles last night to return something I lost," he said, his voice steady. And the simplicity of that statement carried more impact than any elaborate explanation could have, because it revealed a truth that could not be easily dismissed or reinterpreted. And the manager's expression shifted again, the certainty he had carried earlier replaced by something less defined, something closer to hesitation, because the narrative he had assumed no longer fit the reality in front of him. The silence that followed was different from the ones before, heavier, more reflective, and Emily felt it as clearly as anyone else in the room. Not as validation, not as victory, but as a shift, a small but meaningful change in how she was being seen. And as Alexander stood there, no longer observing, no longer distant, but fully present in a moment he had chosen to step into, it became clear that what had started with a single careless sentence was now becoming something else entirely, something that neither of them could ignore, and something that was beginning to reshape more than just their understanding of each other. The silence that followed Alexander Haza's words did not break immediately. It deepened, settling over the room like something heavier than sound, because what had just been said could not be undone or ignored, and for a moment no one moved. Not the manager, not the staff, not even the guests who had only partially understood the situation but felt the shift all the same, and in the center of it stood Emily Carter, still holding her place in a world that had rarely paused long enough to truly see her. The manager cleared his throat quietly, his composure returning in fragments, but not fully restored. "If there has been any misunderstanding, we value all of our staff," he said, his tone careful now, measured in a way that revealed more about the pressure he felt than the confidence he wanted to project. And Alexander did not interrupt him this time. Not because he agreed, but because the moment had already moved beyond correction. It was now about what came next. He turned slightly, his gaze returning to Emily, and for a brief second the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade again, replaced by something more personal, more direct. "You should not have to prove your worth to be treated with respect," he said. And this time his words were not aimed at the room, not aimed at the manager, but at her. And the difference in that intention was clear, because it carried no performance, no need for validation, only acknowledgement. Emily held his gaze, her expression steady, but something within it had shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to everyone else, but enough that the weight she had carried alone for so long no longer felt entirely isolated in that moment. And she gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in recognition, because she understood what he was trying to say, even if she did not fully trust how lasting it would be. The room slowly began to move again. Conversations resuming in quieter tones, staff returning to their tasks with a subtle awareness that something had just changed, and the manager stepped back, his authority no longer as firm as it had been before, because it had been questioned in a way that could not easily be dismissed. And as he turned away, the dynamic he had relied on no longer felt as certain. Alexander remained where he was for a moment longer, then reached into his coat. But this time, when he pulled something out, it was not money, not a quick solution, but a small, simple card, and he held it out toward Emily. Not as an offer, but as an option. If you ever decide you want something different, not easier, just different, call me, he said, and there was no expectation in his voice, no assumption that she would accept, only the acknowledgement that the choice would be hers, and that alone made the gesture different from anything he had done before. Emily looked at the card, then back at him, and for a moment she did not take it, because she understood what it represented, not just an opportunity, but a shift in direction, one that could change the path she had been walking for years. And after a second, she reached out, taking it carefully, not as someone accepting help, but as someone acknowledging that a door had been opened, even if she had not yet decided whether to walk through it. Thank you, she said, her voice quiet, but steady, and Alexander nodded once, not pressing further, because he had begun to understand that not everything needed to be decided in a single moment. He stepped back then, giving her space, not as a retreat, but as a sign that the control he once held over every situation no longer applied here. And as he turned to leave, the room shifted slightly again, not in the same way as before, but with a quieter awareness, because something had been acknowledged that could not be easily forgotten. Emily stood there for a second longer, the card in her hand, the weight of it different from anything she had carried before, not heavy, not burdensome, but significant, because it represented a possibility she had not planned for. And as she slipped it in her pocket and returned to her work, the rhythm of the restaurant continued. But beneath it, something had changed, something subtle but real, because for the first time, the distance between two completely different worlds had not just been crossed, it had been recognized, and that recognition carried forward into everything that would come next. The days that followed did not change everything at once, but they changed enough, and sometimes that was more powerful than anything sudden or dramatic, because real shifts rarely happened in a single moment. They unfolded quietly, step by step, just like the miles Emily Carter had walked that night. She did not call Alexander Hayes immediately, not the next day, not even the day after that, because her life did not pause simply because an opportunity appeared. Her shifts remained long. Her responsibilities unchanged. Her younger sister still needed her, and the rhythm she had built did not bend easily, but the card stayed in her pocket, not forgotten, not ignored, simply waiting, like a choice she would make on her own time. Across the city, Alexander returned to his world as well. Meetings resumed, decisions were made, the machinery of his company moved forward with its usual precision. But something within him had shifted in a way that did not fade, because he could no longer move through that world without noticing what he had once overlooked, the people behind the systems, the quiet lives that existed beyond his reach, and slowly, without announcement, without press releases or public statements, changes began to appear in the way his company operated, policies adjusted, expectations reevaluated, not as a performance, but as a reflection of something he had begun to understand. A week later, on a morning that felt no different from any other, Emily stood outside a small repair shop, her shoes resting on the counter as the owner examined them carefully. "They have been through a lot," he said, his tone thoughtful, and Emily gave a small smile. "They have," she replied, and for a moment she considered leaving them as they were, worn but familiar, a reflection of everything they had carried her through. But then she nodded once. "Can you fix them?" she asked, and the owner smiled slightly. "I can make them stronger," he said, and that was enough. Later that day, as she stepped out of the shop wearing the same shoes, now carefully restored, the stitching reinforced, the fabric cleaned but still unmistakably hers, she paused for a moment, looking down at them, not as something that needed to be hidden, but as something that had endured, something that had carried her forward when nothing else could. And with a quiet breath, she reached into her pocket, pulling out the card she had been carrying, turning it over once before, making her decision. When Alexander's phone rang, he answered without hesitation, not because he expected the call, but because he had hoped for it. And when he heard her voice on the other end, calm, steady, unmistakable, he did not interrupt. He did not rush. He simply listened, because he understood now that what mattered was not what he offered, but what she chose, and when she finished. There was a brief pause before he responded, his voice different from the man he had been when they first met. "I would like that," he said. And this time, it was not a transaction, not a solution, but an invitation to something built on understanding rather than assumption. Weeks later, in a space that felt nothing like the restaurant where it had all begun, Emily stood in a new role, not removed from who she was, but expanded. Beyond it, working within a program that supported employees like her, people who had been overlooked, underestimated, and yet carried a strength that could not be measured in simple terms, and Alexander stood nearby, not above, not separate, but present, watching not with ownership but with respect. And when their eyes met again, the distance between them no longer felt defined by what separated them, but by what they had both chosen to change. And as Emily took a step forward, her restored, shoes steady against the floor, carrying her not away from her past, but into something new, Alexander understood something he had never fully grasped before, that true worth was never determined by what someone wore or where they stood, but by what they chose to do when no one was watching. And in that understanding, something lasting had finally taken root, not just between them, but within the world they were now shaping together.